I'm Beth Perrell with Cora Berchem. She's the Save the Manatee Club's Director of Multimedia and Manatee Research Associate. We're going to talk about the status of the manatee right now and the lifespan and just, Cora, anything interesting going on with them. But I do want to mention right here at the start that the main reason we're talking is because you have an adoption program. So you want to give us a little thumbnail of that adoption program?
Yes, absolutely. So, yes, Save the Manatee Club has an adoption program. We are a nonprofit organization, and we have currently about 30 manatees, a bit over 30 manatees in our adoption program. And the way the program works is people from literally all over the world can adopt their own manatee. They don't have to take it home and take care of it. We do all of that for them. But basically, they pick a manatee and they get an adoption certificate and biography, which is everything that we know about the manatee, as well as our membership handbook and our quarterly newsletter. And all of those manatees in our program are actually real living manatees that we can keep track of. So a lot of them live right here at Blue Springs State Park, which is just a bit north of Orlando in Florida. So people can actually come there in the wintertime and see their adopted manatees. And we try to provide updates throughout the year, who has a calf or who is seen on certain dates, those kind of things, to, sort of keep it interactive so people feel like they're involved and they're caring for, an animal and trying to support our conservation efforts at the same time.
Real good. And how do people participate in that? Just go to savethemanatee.org?
Yes, exactly. They can either way go to our website, savethemanatee.org/adopt, or they can also call us. We're open Monday through Friday, so they can also do that adoption over the phone. So what they do is they can scroll through the manatees that are available for adoption and then pick their favorite adoptee. The adoptions start at $25 a year, and it's a yearly fee. So after a year, you can decide if you want to renew it or if you want to adopt a different manatee. And then they can do that over the phone or online, and we will send them the materials in the mail.
Real good. Well, let's go ahead and talk about the Save the Manatee Club. So what do you do on a day-to-day basis? You're tracking the manatees, just collecting the science on the numbers?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we do a lot of different work for manatees. Our primary goal is public education outreach. So we participate in a lot of events, a lot of activities where we talk to the public or talk to the boating community. We do distribute a lot of free educational materials as well as boater awareness materials. And then we also participate in a lot of legal work for manatees. So let's say anytime Springs protection is on the agenda or new speed zones or new boat ramps or marinas being put in, basically anything that would affect the manatees or their aquatic habitat, that's when we step in and give them a voice. And then also what I do, especially in the wintertime, is participate with the research at Blue Springs State Park. So what we do every morning, we actually go out on a canoe and we count the manatees, but we also identify individuals. And the way we do that is by the scars that they have. So basically every manatee, almost every manatee, unfortunately, has been hit by a boat at some point in its life. So that's what makes it possible for us to keep track of those manatees, identify them, and then collect all of that data. So that's what we do in the wintertime, basically between November and March when manatees come to those warm water sites. So the participation in the research is a really big part of what we do. And we are also a partner organization of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, which consists of a lot of different agencies involved in manatee rescues, rehabilitation, release, recovery. So we're part of that organization as well.
You mentioned that the boats are such an issue and, getting hit by the boats are such an issue. But have there also been considerations or challenges posed by the nutrients in the water and all of these algal blooms and that kind of thing?
Yes, absolutely. So unfortunately, manatees, although they have no natural predators at all, they are considered a threatened species. So they do face a lot of different issues, boats being the number one human-related cause of death for manatees. However, there's a lot of other problems for them as well. And like you just mentioned, nutrient pollution is a really big problem. For example, we've seen an increase in algae blooms, whether that's those blue-green algae blooms that might actually clutter the seagrasses and, prevent sunlight getting to the seagrasses, which is the main food for manatees. So that can be a really big problem for them. Red tide is also a really big problem for manatees. We had a bad red tide in 2018, and we actually lost over 200 manatees that year to red tide. It's sort of a neurotoxin to them, so if they eat seagrasses that have red tide on them, or if they inhale the toxins, they can actually have seizures and then drown. So if they're not rescued in time, a lot of manatees can be fatal for them if they are in a region where they have a big red tide. And then anything regarding water quality and quantity, so a lot of overpumping of the springs or, degradation of water, whether that's a spring or any other body of water, obviously affects the manatees as well, as it can change their food sources or just the availability of water and warm water that they have in the wintertime. So all of that, all of these different causes sort of contribute to the problems that the manatees are facing right now.
You mentioned the 2018 red tide, and it was such a mystery at that point. What has been learned, and therefore what have we learned to mitigate the possibility that this would happen again?
Yeah, so the red tide is sort of a two-pronged sword. It's a kind of a weird situation because essentially red tide is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It usually occurs in the Gulf of Mexico offshore, and it doesn't really affect manatees, if it doesn't move inland. But what's happening, especially in 2018, was the red tide was around for so long because it moved inshore and then basically met all the nutrients that were coming from the shore. So there can be anything from freshwater releases from Lake Okeechobee, there can be fertilizers from, home fertilizing or agriculture, runoff, septic tanks, all a variety of sources. But this sort of super bloomed, it created a super bloom for the red tide. So the red tide stuck around for a lot longer than it usually does. And that's why it did affect so many manatees. And so some of the things we've certainly learned is, that human use of the waterways and anything that goes into the waterways can contribute to red tides being so much stronger. Unfortunately, we also have a lot of things that are sort of not under our control. We do see a lot of red tides after bad hurricanes have moved through, so usually the waters are more stirred up or they're warmer, which can then fuel a red tide, which is something that we have little control over, to change any of that. But in years like that, it's ever so more important to work on all the other issues affecting manatees so that if we have a bad red tide and we're losing a lot of manatees to that red tide, to try to work in other areas like boat collisions or pollution of waterways to make sure that we don't lose a lot of manatees on those levels as well.
So the advocacy and the awareness has to happen on several levels, and you starting with the idea of boat safety. Why don't you describe the different awareness programs you have underway, and as a piece of that, would you let us know the status of the manatee, the numbers, and what you're finding? Yeah,
absolutely. So luckily, manatee numbers have gone up. They have definitely increased since the counting began. Over the last couple of years, the Synoptic Survey, which is something that we, along with all of our partner agencies, do on a yearly basis, we try to count the manatees all over Florida. So there have been numbers between 5,000 and 6,000 pretty consistently over the last couple of years. So while the number of manatees has increased, the threats that the manatees are facing, unfortunately, have increased as well. So that's one of our big advocacy pieces that we're trying to get across to the public, that although the manatees were downlisted from the endangered status to the threatened status by the federal government about 3 years ago, that decision was mainly based on the growing numbers of manatees. However, if you look back on the reason why manatees were initially listed as endangered was because of the threats that they were facing at the time. And those threats over the years have gone up and they have not diminished. So we really need to be very vigilant about keeping those protections in place and also trying to convey to the public that the manatee is not completely out of the woods yet. So we still need to be very careful, when we're boating or when we're out there recreating, fishing, swimming, all those kind of things, make sure that manatee protections are still in place. And that sort of brings me to, one of the leading things we are trying to do is work with the public and work with the boating community to provide education on how to safely boat around manatees, how to avoid harassment. A lot of people come to Florida to boat. They don't even know that there is such a thing called a manatee. I have to admit myself that until about 8 years ago, I had never heard of a manatee before. And I've always been very interested in marine biology and the environment. So, you can only imagine there's a lot of people out there who don't even know there is such an animal named a sea cow or a manatee sharing the waterways. So that education is really one of the number one things that we work on, along with letting people know how to properly behave around manatees. A lot of people think It's okay to touch them. It's okay to provide food or water to them, that they actually like that, but they don't see the bigger picture of a manatee getting very habituated to a person or to a boat, which can then put it in harm's way in the long run. So that's one of our main things is education, awareness, and getting the public involved, to care for the manatees.
I have to mention a little sidebar is that the Save the Manatee Club actually has cameras out, and people who maybe are unfamiliar with manatees, that's a great place to start, just to watch those cameras or the recordings of the feed, because you'll just see these amazing creatures, and they're just peaceful, and it's, again, a way to learn a little bit about them.
Yes, absolutely. That was actually the thing that I initially came on to work with Save the Manatee Club was those webcams. We had those 2 webcams up at Blue Spring State Park, and they can be seen at manatees.org, or if you go to our website, there's a link on our website as well where people can watch them. And then we recently also installed 2 additional cameras over at Homosassa Springs State Park on the other coast. So really people from anywhere can watch them. I know there's a lot of school classes who actually have the cameras up in their classroom, and they're watching the manatees, from Ohio or Michigan or something in the wintertime, and just sort of get familiar with them. And then we also try to provide a lot of educational videos and, Q&As to the public via our website and our newsletters, our social media, so that people can, get their questions answered, and sort of, sometimes an image or video speaks a million words. So if people actually see, those mothers in their calves sort of floating around on our webcams, that really affects them. And we have a lot of people who really enjoy watching the webcams. So I'm glad you mentioned that, yeah.
Well, go ahead and teach us a little bit about the lifespan of the manatee. You mentioned earlier that the winter, up through March, is when they're very active. But where do they live? Where can we see them? Where do they go? Yeah, that's a good question. So I know your first question was sort of like their lifespan. So manatees, they're related to the elephants. It's actually their closest living relative. A lot of people would think it's a dolphin, a seal, or a whale, but the elephant is actually the closest living relative to the manatee now. And elephants can live a very long life, and so can manatees. The oldest living manatee on record was actually 69 years old. We do have some manatees at Blue Spring that we have tracked since the early 1970s, when Jacques Cousteau made his famous documentary, The Forgotten Mermaid. So those individuals are certainly now in their 40s or 50s. We don't know when they were born, so we don't have an exact birth date for them, but they're definitely up there. Unfortunately, the average lifespan right now for a Florida manatee is only between 7 and 13 years of age, which is really young. One of the reasons that average is so low is because we lose a lot of small manatees. We call those perinatal deaths. So those are manatees under a certain size. And so the calf mortality rate is pretty high, but then also like all the threats I mentioned earlier contribute to them not able to live as long as they really should. If they're undisturbed in the wild, they can definitely live really long lives. So in terms of habitat, manatees are mammals, so they can live in salt, fresh, and brackish water, and they can actually go in between. They can go back and forth. So in the wintertime, they do require water that's over 68 degrees. Anytime the water temperatures drop, they do have to migrate to those warm water sources. That's why in the wintertime, places like Blue Spring State Park, Crystal River, Homosassa, any of the outflows of power plants, for example, that's where you can find manatees because they come to those sites for the warm water that they provide. Now that it's sort of, late March, they're starting to migrate to their summer habitat. So you can find them anywhere in rivers, estuaries, lakes, coastal areas. So they're a lot more spread out in the summertime than they are in the wintertime. They're sort of just, going with the flow. Some of them are migrating up to the Carolinas or even Georgia, or even further than that. Some will migrate over to Alabama, Louisiana, or even as far west as Texas. And others stay around Florida. They may travel from Blue Spring up into the St. Johns River. They may go out into the Atlantic Ocean, but they're sort of more spread out during the summertime, so to speak. Mentioning the age, the young average there, given that they can live so much longer, is just astounding. That must also impact whether or not they have enough calves.
Yes, absolutely. And manatees mature pretty slowly. So female will usually mature around the age of 4 to 5. A male even later around the age of 7 or 9. So obviously, if they don't live very long lives, they won't produce all that many offspring. Manatees will usually only have one calf at a time because calves are already pretty big at birth. They're about 60 to 70 pounds when they're born. So it's usually one calf at a time, and the gestation period is about a year. So from the moment they get pregnant until they actually give birth to the calf will take almost an entire year. And then the mother will take care of that calf for about 1 to 2 years. So they don't reproduce very quickly. There's a high investment into that one calf, and then they will start reproducing again. But it is a problem that a lot of the manatees, if they die that young, will not be able to live long enough to actually reproduce and have calves and replenish the population. And that's also a real problem if we're having a bad year like a red tide, which can kill manatees of all age classes. So that may affect a lot of the big mature females and males. And, if we lose a lot of those reproductive females, it will take longer to sort of replenish the population because they don't reproduce, all that quickly.
What is the Save the Manatee Club's involvement in rescues of manatees that have been injured?
Yeah, so we are part of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, and while the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, FWC, is the main agency in charge of rescue and release of manatees, we do assist with that in many different ways. For example, if there is a manatee at Blue Spring or any of the sites that we monitor that's in distress, we do provide that information to FWC. So we take photos and video, we monitor behavior, and then if there is a rescue, if it's deemed to be a manatee in need of rescue, we will help with the rescue and then getting it to the facility until it's released back out into the wild. So we assist with those releases as well. We'll also have weekly calls with our partners of the Manatee Rehabilitation Partnership. So if there's any specific needs that the facilities have or any scientific input that needs to be provided, if there's a manatee, we need to discuss whether that's releasable or not or where it can be released. We also provide that kind of scientific input to our partners as well. And so it depends on, where the manatee rescue is happening or the releases, but we also actively participate in them, usually when they're happening at Blue Spring.
This is perhaps a related question, but I know you're a Manatee Research Associate. What kind of research is underway right now?
So the main thing that we do at Save the Manatee Club is continue the life history program, like the genealogy program at Blue Spring. So trying to track the manatees over time to figure out the adult survival rate as well as the reproduction rate. So we record how many calves are born every year. We try to keep track of the calves as best as possible as well. We also document how many manatees are hit by boats over a winter season to get that data to see, where are more protection zones needed, for example. We're also studying how they're behaving around Blue Spring. For example, how is the cold affecting them? How do they interact with each other? Those kind of things that we study at Blue Spring. We're also using the webcams that I mentioned earlier, our underwater and above water webcam, to assist with post-release monitoring of manatees, for example. So manatees that have been outfitted with tracking devices that are frequenting the spring, we can also get additional data for our co-researchers from those webcams. And so that's one of the things we're doing as well. One project I've been working on over the past couple of years is monitoring manatee usage of Blue Spring during the summertime. Manatees, like I said, usually use the springs when it gets cold, meaning during the winter time, because they need that warm water. But over the last couple of years, we've also seen more manatees visiting Blue Spring in the summertime. And since the park is open to swimming and scuba diving and tubing and all of that, there's a lot of interaction between people and manatees. So we're trying to, see what brings them in there and how is the interaction with people, how is that happening, how is that potentially affecting them. So that's one of the projects I've been working on over the past couple of years, getting data of how many manatees we see, how many individuals we see, and when it sort of pikes, like when we see most manatees in there as well.
Are there any trends that are emerging at the early stages in that game?
I mean, I can only say that from when I started working here about 6 years ago, we only saw about a handful of manatees coming in, which was usually mothers ready to give birth to a calf. And now we are consistently seeing manatees almost every single day. So they're definitely using it more. It could have to do with them trying to get out of the way from boats in the river. It could also have to do with the population in the Blue Spring region increasing. So, if we see more manatees in the winter, then we're also going to see more manatees in the summertime. So that's one of the aspects I'm looking at as well. So I'm not entirely sure yet, but that's sort of developing. And we've definitely also documented the reproduction rate at Blue Spring is pretty high. We usually see mothers weaning their calves after just about a year. So the reproduction rate at Blue Spring is about every 2 years, whereas on the coast, it's usually between 2 and 5 years. So that's another thing we're also looking at. the growth of calves and how fast they're growing in a freshwater environment where they're mainly using the river versus them using a coastal area.
And what about the waterways themselves? For example, the springs and the changes in the flow of the water. Is anything emerging as a concern or a challenge for the manatee?
Yeah, that's definitely something that our conservation department is looking at as well. We do have, obviously the nutrient pollution of the springs, but also the overpumping of groundwater, which is lowering spring levels. And in the near future, a lot of manatees will depend on springs more so than they do right now, even because a large number of manatees right now depends on the warm water outflow of power plants. Now, if these power plants go offline in the future, manatees may need those natural springs to overwinter. So one of our concerns is, number one, is that the overpumping of the springs and of the groundwater will diminish the water quantity in the springs, meaning how many more manatees could potentially winter at a spring if there's just not enough water or if the water levels are very low. Another problem is manatees coming to some of the springs that are not protected. So they're not protected sanctuaries for them during the winter time, meaning people can scuba dive there, people can swim, they can boat there. So manatees are facing those kind of issues as well, coming to those springs to rest and then encountering very large numbers of people and, harassing them potentially. So that's another concern for us, in addition to the degradation of the water quality, is human usage of the springs and not having enough sanctuaries where manatees can rest in the wintertime.
When it comes to these concerns or these challenges, though, what entity or organization or legislative effort can sort of mitigate the negative impact? Is that something for...
It's a good question. So we're working with our partners both on the federal level, the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which is a state agency. So we are trying to, first of all, we have to gather the data to prove that it is happening, and then those agencies may be able to step in and put in, additional sanctuaries or additional feed zones in the rivers, those kind of things where they can actually dedicate certain areas to be protection areas for manatees. It's definitely a multi-agency effort. It's not something that, one agency can just do, but that's why our partners come in, where we work with them on many different levels to try to get those things accomplished as well.
I want to give you an opportunity for anything you wanted to talk about that I didn't bring up, or anything you want to remind us about. And after that, we'll mention once again the adoption program.
Let me think. We talked about so much. I'm trying to figure out if there's anything maybe that I haven't talked about. I mean, I can just one more time express really the educational component of people learning about something. And, if you don't know about it, you can't love it, and then you can't care about it. So I really think that by bringing the manatee to a person, that person can start to know about it, to learn about it, and then to care about it. I mean, I personally didn't even know what a manatee was until a couple of years ago, and now I'm working with them. So I think that's one of sort of a prime example that, if you love something and you're dedicated to it, you can really make a difference. And we have a lot of supporters, all over the world who care about manatees, and it's fascinating to me sometimes to have people from, other countries or other continents coming here and seeing the manatees, and they know about these animals. And then we have people in Florida, they say they've lived here all their lives and they've never seen a manatee before. So I just think there's something about them. They're such majestic, large animals, and they're such an integral part of Florida. But you could be canoeing or kayaking out in the river and wouldn't even know that there's like a 2,000-pound animal right underneath you. So I think they're just this fascinating animal, and they don't get enough credit for that, in my opinion. There's not like any major like TV shows or movies or anything featuring a manatee. You see dolphins, whales, all those kind of animals, but the manatee is sort of like it's sort of left behind a little bit. So I sometimes feel we need to make even more of an effort to sort of get that across and, have people learn about them.
And of course, people can learn about them at savethemanatee.org, get some more information there, access those cameras. Would you go ahead once more and tell us about the Adopt a Manatee program?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So the Adopt a Manatee program is a program that we run here at Save the Manatee Club. We have over 30 manatees right now that are in the adoption program. And the way it works is that people can either way adopt them online or over the phone. You don't have to take them home and take care of them. We do all of that for you. But they're all real living manatees with known histories. So if a person adopts a manatee, we can provide updates about that specific individual. So if you adopt a manatee, you get an adoption certificate and biography, which is everything we know about that individual, as well as our membership handbook and our quarterly newsletter. And adoptions start at $25 a year. It's a yearly fee, so after a year you can decide if you want to renew the adoption or if you want to adopt a different manatee. But it's sort of like it makes people feel like they're involved. They're not just giving to a cause, but they're actually supporting their own specific manatee. So I think that makes it really fun to know you're supporting a creature like that. And you can actually visit them as well during the winter time. A lot of our manatee adoptees live at Blue Spring State Park. They come there in the winter time, so you can either visit them or see them on our webcams. And we also have some adoptees over at Homosassa Springs State Park, which those ones are actually permanent residents. So anytime you visit the park, whether it be in the summer or the winter time, you can see them, and you can also see them on our live webcams as well during the summer months.
Cora Berchem is the Save the Manatee Club's Director of Multimedia and Manatee Research Associate. Again, online, savethemanatee.org. I'm Beth Perrell.